May 9th, 1943, Tunisia. The desert heat pressed down like a weight on Klaus. Becker's chest as he raised his hands above his head. American rifles pointed directly at him. He was 22 years old. His unit had survived 3 days without water. The propaganda officer's words echoed in his mind. Americans showed no mercy to captured German forces. Klaus closed his eyes and waited for the bullet. Instead, an American soldier stepped forward and handed him a canteen. The water was cold, impossibly cold in the desert heat. Klaus drank until his hands trembled, until his stomach cramped, until the realization hit him like a physical blow. Everything he'd been taught about the enemy might have been a lie. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story of Klaus Becker and the shocking truth about American POW camps, hit that like button and subscribe to keep these untold stories alive. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Now, let's return to that moment in the Tunisian desert when Klaus's entire understanding of the war began to unravel. The surrender had come at dawn. Klaus and 47 other German soldiers emerged from behind a destroyed supply depot, their uniforms stiff with dried blood and sand. Their ammunition was gone. Their commanding officer had died from wounds 3 days earlier. American forces had surrounded them during the night, tanks and infantry forming a perimeter that left no possibility of escape. But Klaus's closest friend, Werner Schmidt, had collapsed from dehydration the previous evening. 2 others couldn't walk. The choice was simple and terrible: surrender or watch their comrades die, achieving nothing. Klaus was the senior man remaining, a corporal barely qualified to give orders. He made the decision they would walk out with hands raised. The American soldiers who accepted their surrender looked younger than Klaus expected. Farm boys from places he'd never heard of: Oklahoma, Ohio. Places that existed only as names on maps. A lieutenant approached, maybe 25 years old, dust covering every inch of his uniform. He spoke in broken German: Waffe nieder, keine Bewegung, weapons down, don't move. The Germans complied, dropping rifles that were empty anyway. They stood in the morning sun, hands raised, swaying slightly from dehydration and exhaustion. Klaus watched the American faces for signs of the hatred his training had promised. He saw only fatigue. Then the lieutenant gestured to his medics. Check their wounded first. Get water for all of them. These men look half dead. Within minutes, American medics were examining Werner, starting an IV, loading him onto a stretcher. Other medics moved among the German prisoners, offering canteens, checking for injuries. Klaus accepted water from a soldier who couldn't have been older than 19. The boy nodded and said something in English Klaus couldn't understand, but the tone suggested simple human acknowledgement. Klaus drank. The water tasted clean, free from the chemical tablets they'd used to purify questionable sources. A medic gently took the canteen back, explaining through gestures that drinking too fast would make him sick. Around him, German soldiers were drinking, some crying from relief, others staring at their captors with expressions mixing fear and confusion. This wasn't what they'd been promised. This wasn't the enemy they'd been taught to expect. From the capture point, they were loaded onto trucks, military transports with canvas covers that provided shade. The trucks moved in convoy across desert roads, kicking up dust that filtered through the canvas and settled on everything. Klaus sat beside another prisoner, a private named Friedrich, who'd been conscripted from a farming village in Bavaria. "They're taking us to a camp," Friedrich whispered. "What do you think they'll do to us there?" Klaus didn't answer. He'd heard the same stories Friedrich had about harsh treatment, about prison camps where enemies were worked until they collapsed. But those stories didn't match the medics who treated Werner. The water given freely, the American soldiers who looked at them with something closer to pity than hatred. The convoy reached a processing center by afternoon, a collection of tents surrounded by wire fences with armed guards at regular intervals. The prisoners were unloaded and lined up for registration. American officers with clipboards moved down the line, recording names, ranks, units. Name, an officer asked without hostility. Klaus Becker, Corporal Africa Corps, 21st Panzer Division. The officer wrote methodically. Age 22, hometown, Hamburg. The questioning continued service history, medical conditions, next of kin. It was bureaucratic rather than aggressive. The tone of men processing paperwork rather than interrogating enemies. When Klaus finished, he was directed to a tent where German prisoners sat waiting for the next phase. 2 weeks later, Klaus stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the African coast disappear. The voyage to America would take 3 weeks crossing the Mediterranean to Gibraltar, then Atlantic waters to New York. 3 weeks confined to a ship with hundreds of other German prisoners, all sharing the same uncertainty. The ship was crowded, but not inhumane. Prisoners slept in converted cargo holds on triple-stacked bunks, the air thick with diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. But they were fed twice daily bread and soup, occasionally meat, coffee that was weak but hot. It was more food than Klaus had eaten in the final weeks before capture. American guards maintained order without the harshness Klaus expected. They were mostly older men, too old for combat duty. Some spoke a little German, others communicated through gestures and the universal language of daily routine. On the 5th day at sea, Klaus stood at the rail during the brief period when prisoners were allowed on deck. Werner stood beside him, recovered from dehydration, slowly regaining strength. They watched the ocean roll past, gray-green water stretching to horizons that curved with the Earth's surface. "Do you think we'll survive this?" Werner asked quietly. Klaus considered the question. According to propaganda, they should already be dead. Instead, they were on a ship crossing the Atlantic, fed and housed and treated like logistical challenges rather than hated enemies. "I think," Klaus said slowly, "that we've been lied to about many things." Werner was quiet for a moment. What if everything was lies? Klaus didn't answer because the implications were too vast. If the propaganda about American treatment was false, what else was false? The certainty of victory, the righteousness of their cause. New York Harbor appeared through morning fog like something from a dream. Klaus stood on deck with other prisoners, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from the mist, green copper oxidized by decades of weather, torch raised above a harbor that had received millions of immigrants and was now receiving enemies. The symbolism wasn't lost on Klaus. He'd been taught that America was weak, divided, incapable of sustaining industrial production necessary for modern warfare. Yet the harbor before him suggested something else entirely. Massive cranes loading and unloading cargo, ships of every description moving with coordinated efficiency. A city skyline in the distance that spoke of industrial capacity beyond anything he'd seen in Germany. They docked at a military pier where American soldiers waited with the same bureaucratic organization that had characterized every interaction since capture. The prisoners were processed and loaded onto trains for transport to camps throughout the American interior. The train journey took 4 days. The prisoners rode in passenger cars, actual seats, with windows that allowed them to watch America unfold outside the glass. through Pennsylvania farmland and Ohio factory towns, across the Mississippi River, and into plains that stretched endless beneath skies wider than anything Klaus had known. American guards walked the aisles periodically, but without apparent tension. Some brought food, sandwiches and fruit, coffee and water. They maintained order through presence rather than threat. Klaus sat beside Friedrich, both watching the landscape pass. The abundance struck them most forcefully. Farms that looked prosperous, towns with intact buildings, people going about daily life as if war were a distant concern. In Germany, Klaus said quietly, there is rationing shortages. Every resource dedicated to the war effort. Here, it looks like peacetime. Friedrich nodded. The propaganda said America couldn't sustain a war. This doesn't look collapsed. It was the cognitive dissonance that thousands of German prisoners were experiencing, the disconnect between what they'd been taught and what they were witnessing. Camp Herne appeared through heat shimmer on a June afternoon, rows of barracks, surrounded by wire fencing, guard towers at regular intervals. The train stopped. Klaus and 500 other German prisoners disembarked onto a platform where Texas heat hit them like a physical force. American officers organized them into formation with practiced efficiency. They marched through gates into the camp proper. Klaus was assigned to Barracks 7, a wooden structure raised on blocks. Inside, 2 rows of cots stretched the length of the building, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, 2 blankets. The camp commander addressed them that evening in the mess hall. He spoke in English with a translator providing German. You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated fairly and humanely. You will work agricultural labor primarily. You will be paid a small wage. You will receive adequate food and medical care. You will have access to mail service, recreation is available, sports equipment, a library, religious services. The colonel paused. I know what you've been told about American treatment of prisoners. You'll find it doesn't match reality. Work hard, follow rules, and your time here will be bearable. Some of you may even find it preferable to what you left behind. After the colonel departed, American soldiers distributed dinner. Beef stew with vegetables, bread with butter, coffee, and milk. Klaus stared at his plate, unable to process the abundance. This was more meat than he'd seen in a single meal since before the war began. Friedrich sat beside him, equally stunned. This is what they feed prisoners. Klaus took a bite. The stew was hot, well seasoned, the meat tender. It was better than field rations, better than what civilians in Hamburg had been eating for years. Around the mess hall, 500 German prisoners ate in near silence, confronting the same realization. They'd been prepared for starvation rations. Instead, they were being fed better than German soldiers in combat zones. Days found their rhythm. Wake at 6, breakfast at 6:30, work assignments at 7. Klaus was assigned to agricultural labor, picking cotton in fields that stretched to horizons where heat created mirages that looked like water. The work was hard. Texas summer heat was relentless, but the guards provided water breaks every hour, salt tablets to prevent heat exhaustion, shade tents where prisoners could rest during the hottest afternoon hours. Klaus worked beside Werner and Friedrich, moving through cotton rows with monotonous rhythm. American civilian supervisors watched but didn't drive them with cruelty. The pace was steady but sustainable. At noon, trucks arrived with lunch sandwiches and fruit, water and lemonade. Klaus bit into an apple crisp, sweet, fresh, and wondered when German civilians had last seen fresh fruit. You know what bothers me? Werner said. This is how they treat enemies. Imagine how they treat their own people. The observation settled over the group like a weight. If America could afford to feed prisoners well, to provide adequate housing and medical care, what did that suggest about their overall capacity? By midsummer, Klaus's understanding of reality had shifted fundamentally. The propaganda that shaped his worldview dissolved in the face of daily experience. He watched American efficiency in camp operations, the supply chains that ensured adequate food, the medical care that treated prisoners and American personnel equally. The camp had a library. Klaus spent evenings reading German literature that American authorities had somehow acquired. He read Goethe and Schiller, reminded of a Germany that existed before the regime. He also read American newspapers censored of military information, but still revealing. Articles about industrial production, about women working in factories. America wasn't collapsing. America was mobilizing with terrifying effectiveness. Klaus wrote letters home knowing they'd be censored. He said he was healthy, that treatment was fair, that they shouldn't worry. What he couldn't write was the larger truth that everything they believed was false. Occasionally, local ranchers came to the camp seeking labor. Klaus was selected for a 2-week assignment at a ranch 20 miles away, helping with cattle roundup and fence repair. He and 5 other prisoners were transported by truck, accompanied by 2 guards. The rancher was a man named Tom Caldwell, 60 years old, who'd been working cattle since before Klaus was born. He spoke no German. Klaus spoke limited English. They communicated through gestures and the universal language of physical work. Caldwell taught Klaus to rope, to ride, to repair barbed wire fencing. The work was harder than cotton picking, but more engaging. Klaus found himself enjoying it, the physical challenge, the satisfaction of repairing fence lines that would stand. In the evenings, Caldwell's wife served dinner, beef and potatoes, vegetables from their garden. They ate at the rancher's table, prisoners and guards together. Klaus listened, understanding perhaps half the words but grasping the larger meaning. This man had no particular hatred for German prisoners. He needed labor. They provided it. In return, he treated them with practical courtesy. On the final evening, Caldwell gave each prisoner a package, cigarettes and candy bars. Klaus accepted the gift, struggling to express gratitude. Caldwell waved off the thanks. "You boys worked hard. Fair pay for fair work." The simplicity struck Klaus forcefully. The regime had promised glory, honor, territorial expansion. But it hadn't promised basic fairness, the recognition that work deserved compensation, that enemies were still people entitled to dignity. Mail call became the most anticipated event each week. Klaus received his first letter in August from his mother in Hamburg. The envelope was thin, the paper poor quality. She wrote that she and his father were surviving despite hardships. The bombing had destroyed their neighborhood. Food was scarce. His brother had been conscripted and sent east. She asked if he was being treated well, if the Americans were cruel. Klaus wrote back carefully. He said he was healthy, that work was manageable, that he was receiving adequate food and shelter. He couldn't tell her the truth that he ate better than she did, that America's abundance made Germany's deprivation starkly visible. Other prisoners received similar letters, stories of bombing, destruction, rationing, losses. Friedrich learned his father had died during an air raid. Werner's hometown had been evacuated entirely. The contrast became increasingly apparent. Klaus and his fellow prisoners were safer in captivity than German civilians were in their homeland. They ate better, had more secure shelter, faced less immediate danger. The irony was almost unbearable. By autumn, conversations among prisoners began shifting. The hardcore believers in the regime became isolated minorities. Most prisoners were confronting uncomfortable truths. Klaus participated in these discussions during evening hours. The conversations were careful, even among prisoners. There were informers, but doubt spread nonetheless. Werner expressed what many were thinking one evening. We were told America was weak. They're not weak. We were told they'd collapse economically. Their economy is supporting a war on 2 continents while feeding prisoners better than our own civilians eat. We were told they lacked industrial capacity. They're building ships faster than submarines can sink them. He paused, voice dropping to a whisper. We were lied to about everything. And now we're in camps thousands of miles from home while our families starve and our cities burn. Klaus had no answer. Propaganda had crumbled under reality. December brought Christmas, and with it, an almost overwhelming display of American capability. The camp organized a celebration with decorated trees, special meals, and care packages. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall served a feast: turkey, ham, vegetables, pies shared by guards and prisoners without tension. Carols in German and English blurred the line between captor and captive. After dinner, packages from American relief groups arrived with cigarettes, candy, and letters from families wishing the prisoners well. Klaus opened a letter from a family in Iowa with 3 sons overseas. They hoped enemy soldiers treated their boys as kindly as Americans treated German POWs. Friedrich read it and whispered, "How do we fight people like this?" Klaus could only answer, "We can't." In May 1945, news of Germany's unconditional surrender reached Camp Herne, bringing relief, anxiety, and shame. As occupation forces exposed the reality of the regime's civilian camps, targeted policies, atrocities American authorities showed films and photographs Klaus watched. Thinking of his service and realizing he had defended a government guilty of crimes it had accused others of committing, by 1946 repatriation loomed. Some prisoners wanted to return home. Others, like Klaus, wondered if they might stay. He'd worked hard, learned English, and remained in good standing. In December 1945, Tom Caldwell visited and offered to sponsor him. "The war's over," Caldwell said. "You boys didn't start it. I need good workers." Klaus accepted. Months of paperwork followed, but in June 1946 he left Camp Herne as an immigrant. He worked for Caldwell for 8 years, married in 1952, raised 3 children, and became a citizen in 1955, German by birth, American by choice. He died in 2003 at 82. His obituary focused on ranching and community life, but those who knew him understood his story was one of transformation. Fair treatment had dismantled propaganda and revealed American commitment to dignity and law. Camp Herne closed in 1946. Its building's gone, but its legacy living in men like Klaus Becker soldiers who expected cruelty and found instead humanity, and in that humanity discovered the possibility of peace.